The world's first ever human heart transplant. I'm sure we all recognise one of these. It's an organ donation card. This gives the relevant medical professionals permission in the time of our untimely death to use our vital organs to try and give someone else the gift of life. But where did organ donation start and how did it all begin? Well, the answer to that question, ladies and gentlemen, is the world's first ever human heart transplant took place at the Groote Schuur Hospital in Cape Town, South Africa on December the 3rd, 1967. But before we go into that story, it's necessary to take a look back at a little bit of South African history. Now, the south of Africa has long had a troubled past of warring African tribes and warring European colonies, and it was the Dutch who first colonised the Cape in about 1650. One day in 1650, some Dutch merchants were on their way to the spice lands of Asia. These days you can get on a plane and be in Asia in 8 hours, but in those days it would have taken at least 8 months. The journey would have been fraught with dangers like shipwrecks, pirates, and you would have had to have relied on the wind to carry you, and conditions on board would have been cramped and you would have had to have put up with things like vitamin deficiencies and diseases. So by the time you reached Asia you would have been absolutely exhausted. They needed somewhere to stop off and rest, and they discovered Cape Town in about 1650. They discovered that it was a beautiful place just right for a rest stop, and they stopped off on their way back to Europe. When they got back to Europe, news of the new land they discovered spread like wildfire, and pretty soon more and more European colonies were heading off to the Cape to try and discover its mineral wealth or to try and escape persecution in their own lands. They soon discovered that there was indeed a fortune to be found in South Africa, as most of the world's gold and diamonds come from there, and pretty soon more and more European colonies were heading out. By the mid-19th century there was a distinct conflict in interests between the Dutch South Africans by now, who were calling themselves Boers or Afrikaners, and the British South Africans that had a big mining interest there. The Boers were annoyed with the British for taking over the land that they'd discovered, and by the late 19th century an event took place called the Boer War. The Boer War lasted from 1898 to 1902, and the Boers and the British went to war. Most people think that the Nazis invented concentration camps, but it wasn't. It was the British under General Kitchener during the Boer War. They used this weapon against the Boers, and they defeated them in 1902, and the Boers surrendered at Ladysmith, and now South Africa came under British control. South Africa remained under British control until after World War II, when an Afrikaans nationalist government was voted in. And now this Afrikaans nationalist government implemented the hated regime of apartheid. What apartheid meant in the Afrikaans dialect of Dutch was apart, and what it meant in practicality was segregation. The two peoples of South Africa were now split into two groups, whites and non-whites. If you were white, you had all the freedoms that life had to offer, but if you were non-white, your movements were very restricted indeed. You were forced to live in squalid shanty towns with all the associated diseases, you were forced to work for a pittance for the white man, and most of all, you were forced to carry the hated passbook. The passbook was an attempt by the Afrikaans government to control the movements of the non-whites. In it you'd have your picture, your personal details like your sex, height, weight and eye colour, things like weapons and driving licences and residency and work permits. You certainly wouldn't get housed or employed without one of these books, and failure to produce one when stopped by the police could result in imprisonment. Quite naturally, the non-whites didn't like being treated like this and rose up wherever they could. Initially, the rest of the world tolerated the apartheid regime. That wasn't until an event happened in 1960 called the Sharpeville Massacre. Sharpeville was a small township in the Transvaal area of South Africa, just outside Johannesburg, and on the day in question, a huge demonstration was planned outside the town's main police station. The police officer in charge on that day, Lieutenant Colonel Pienaar, was on nervous tenterhooks, as was his deputy, Major Van Zyl. The reason that the two men were on nervous tenterhooks was because of an event that had happened 2 months earlier in the South African city of Durban, when some police officers had been gunned down when they had tried to close an illegal beer hall. By midday, the crowd outside the police station had grown to over 2,000 strong and were pressing against a perimeter fence. The police officers inside the heavily fortified compound were heavily armed with mounted machine guns and long-distance rifles, and when the crowd started pressing too hard against the perimeter fence, Lieutenant Colonel Pienaar panicked and gave his men the order to fire on the crowd. His men opened up on the crowd with everything they had, killing 69 people, including women and children, and injuring dozens more. When they'd run out of bullets, they came out of the police station to inspect their handiwork, did little to nothing to help the wounded or the dying, and simply went home for tea. Unfortunately for Lieutenant Colonel Pienaar, a British journalist had been present in the crowd and had witnessed the massacre. He now ran to the South African newspapers to try and report the atrocity. But the administration of the time under Hendrik Verwoerd had a tight grip on the state media, and the British journalist found that the South African newspapers wouldn't report the atrocity. Unluckily for Verwoerd, he managed to get back to Fleet Street in London, and now the whole world was able to learn about the goings-on at Sharpeville. When Verwoerd himself was approached for an explanation, he publicly refused to condemn the massacre or let any of the men responsible face charge. After this event, South Africa was no longer seen as a civilized nation, and the rest of the world took out huge sanctions against her. But 7 years later, an event would happen which would shine a much more positive light on South Africa, and that was known as the world's first ever human heart transplant. There was once a brilliant young doctor called Christian Barnard. Christian Barnard had been born in the Cape in 1923, the son of Dutch missionary parents. He was one of 4 boys, and during early childhood he had lost a brother to heart failure. This had absolutely devastated him, and it is thought that this was the reason that he chose to spend the rest of his life furthering the cause of cardiac medicine. He was a bright lad that easily graduated as a doctor from the Cape Town University, and after his graduation he went on to do his internship at the Groote Schuur Hospital in Cape Town. After his internship he went back to the Cape Town University to specialise as a cardiologist. During his specialisation he spent a year in the University of Michigan, where he with some colleagues tried to transplant the hearts of dogs. However, the recipients didn't tend to live much longer than a couple of hours. He was nearly pipped to the post of being the world's first ever heart transplant surgeon when an American doctor had the right set of circumstances, a clinically dead patient and a patient in need of a heart transplant. But because state law prohibited him from removing the heart of the clinically dead patient, the operation couldn't go ahead. He then tried using the heart of a laboratory chimp, but because a chimpanzee's heart is considerably smaller than a human being's heart, the patient didn't live much longer than a couple of hours. Chris Barnard returned home to South Africa, frustrated but determined that one day a human heart transplant could become a reality, and he would be the man to prove it. There was once a man called Louis Washansky. Louis Washansky hadn't been born South African but Lithuanian Jewish, but during childhood his parents had fled Lithuania to escape anti-Semitic persecution and had come to settle in Cape Town, South Africa. He went to school there and served with the South African Army during World War II in North Africa against Rommel. After the war years he came back to South Africa and took up a fairly uniform sort of life, getting married and having a couple of kids, and taking up work as a wholesale grocer. During his younger day he was a keen sportsman and bodybuilder, but by his 50s he had some major health problems as he'd suffered 2 heart attacks and strokes, and by 1967 he lay dying in the Groote Schuur Hospital, a patient of Christian Barnard. Chris Barnard realised he needed a heart transplant, but the question then arose where to find a donor. The answer came through the door on December the 3rd, 1967. There was once a beautiful young woman by the name of Denise Ann Darvell. Denise had been born in the Cape in 1943, and according to her parents she was a very loving, caring child, always putting other people's needs before her own. In later years her father would fondly recount how every year on his birthday she would always bake him a cake with the words, "Daddy, we love you," iced on the top, right next to a couple of hearts. He also remembered how, when his little girl left school and went to work in a bank, with her first week's wages, she'd bought presents for everyone, including a bathrobe for him. She was like that. Now, Denise probably would have been a typical 60s sort of chick, into things like the Beatles, the Stones and the Doors, and she certainly had a keen interest in fashion, as her main interest was designing and making her own clothes. Examples of her work are on display at the Groote Schuur Hospital Museum. Denise also had a brand new car that she used to like to drive to places, and on the day in question, December the 3rd, 1967, the Darvell family had been invited out to afternoon tea in the Cape Town suburb of Observatory. Off they set with Denise at the wheel and her brother Keith on the passenger seat and her parents in the back. As they drove, they sang along to pop songs on the radio and behaved in the general carefree manner that kids of their age would have. En route to their friend's house, they decided to stop off at a bakery to buy a cake as their contribution to the afternoon tea. Denise pulled over on the left, and her and her mother got out and went into the bakery. They bought a cake, but when they came out of the bakery and tried to cross the road to get back to the car, tragedy struck. A drunk driver came out of nowhere and ran them both over, killing Mrs. Darvell instantly and flinging Denise across the road, where she bashed her head on the hubcap of her own parked car. As a bizarre twist of fate, Anne Washansky, Lewis's wife, drove past the scene of the accident on her way home from visiting her husband Lewis in hospital. When she saw how serious the accident was, being a kindly soul and feeling desperately sorry for the poor people involved, she tried to turn her head away. Little did she realise that one of the broken bodies lying there in the street would give her husband Lewis the chance for a new life. Denise and her mother were rushed off to the Gloucestershire Hospital by ambulance, where sadly Mrs. Darvell was pronounced dead on arrival, and Denise was whisked off to be seen by a brain specialist, who came back with the very sad news that her brain injury was so severe that she'd never survive without the aid of a life support machine. Upon hearing of the accident, Chris Barnard came running to see her father, to express his sincere sympathy and to ask to be allowed to use Denise's heart to try and save Louis Washansky. Mr. Darvell thought back to how loving and caring his daughter had been throughout her short life, and in later years he would recount, "If I hadn't have done it, I would have just been haunted by Denise's voice saying, 'Daddy, why didn't you do it? Why didn't you let the other man live?'" His precise words to Chris Barnard were, "Well, Doctor, if you can't save my daughter, then please let the other man live." He gave permission, and the world's first ever human heart transplant took place. Now, sadly, Louis Washansky only lived for 18 days after the operation before dying of a lung infection brought on by the anti-rejection drugs, but nevertheless, a medical milestone akin to walking on the moon had been achieved, and today, with the right aftercare, you can expect between 5 and 20 years more life. Another great thing about Chris Barnard was his hatred of the apartheid regime. He actively campaigned for its end until it broke down in the 1990s. He spent the rest of his professional life touring the world, giving lectures on how to master the technique he had pioneered, and he carried on working until arthritis crippled up his hands and he could no longer hold surgical instruments. He spent his retirement years between his farm in South Africa and the Greek holiday islands, where he loved to holiday, and it was in Cyprus in 2000 that he himself died of a heart attack, but then he was 79. So, the next time you take a look in your wallet and see one of these cards, you'll now know the story behind the world's first ever human heart transplant. And if you haven't already registered, why not do something amazing today and give someone else the chance for a new life?